Mr. Speaker, the Good Samaritan Food Donation Bill being debated today is, in my view, a valuable piece of legislation that will improve the incentives for donations of food made in good faith, while helping those in need, combating waste, and promoting environmental sustainability. For this reason, the Workers' Party supports the bill. Let me begin first by acknowledging Member Louis Ng for his work on this front. I believe that he first flagged food waste as an issue back in 2018, before following up with a suggestion for a Good Samaritan Act in 2020. The bill today is a culmination of his efforts. I should also disclose at the outset that there are currently various food rescue and distribution programs in operation across Sengkang GRC, the constituency that I serve, and that I and my fellow Sengkang MPs have at various times in the past participated in these community-led initiatives while also offering our support to them. This is also the case for several other Workers' Party divisions in Aokang and Aljunied GRCs. So, the bill seeks to provide indemnity to food donors so long as reasonable steps have been followed to ensure that food safety and hygiene standards are being met. The four stipulations outlined in Clause 4 of the bill delineate these conditions while ensuring consistency with existing laws. Part D, for example, requires that measures be taken to, and I quote, comply with any applicable requirement under any written law relating to food safety and good hygiene, end quote. Now, this is sensible, and the circumstance that especially comes to mind pertains to the existing NEA guidelines for catered meals, which limits the consumption time of food at room temperature to 4 hours from the time it is cooked. Notably, however, the observed duration is a guideline and, as far as I'm aware, not mandated by law. This strikes me as fair since we do not wish to excessively police folks who may decide to tap out leftovers, nor would a blanket requirement cater for the wide variation in windows for safe consumption of different types of foods. After all, I would be far more comfortable stuffing my face with a day-old cupcake, for instance, than I would with a day-old plate of laksa. However, how would the fact that these existing guidelines not crossing the threshold of the law alter the stipulation in Part D? Would a potential donor be able to pass along leftover food that had been in a buffet line for 4.5 hours to the youth hostel next door, for example, under this bill? I understand that Part C does insist on informing recipients of the timeline for safe consumption, but does this also imply that donating food that exceeds this duration is permissible so long as this step is undertaken? Would it perhaps be safer for the case of cooked food that a donated food label be affixed? This approach aligns with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition of qualifying food under the Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. Finally, it may also be useful if it's made explicit that the stipulations in Clause 4 apply to donors who do so in good faith. In particular, I would suggest that line 19 of page 5 consider the inclusion of this term so that it would read a food donor who donates any food in good faith shall not in fact be liable, and so on. Now, I'll also observe that this is not the first time that questions concerning Good Samaritan Acts have been discussed in Parliament. This occurred on 4 prior occasions in 2008, 2012, and 2014 by former PAP MP Associate Professor Fatima Latif, and more recently in 2021 by the Honourable Member Hazel Phua. To be clear, on each of these occasions, the then Ministers of Law explained that such legislation was unnecessary since both civil and criminal liability would generally be waived for those acting in good faith. And it was stated explicitly that our current laws strike the correct balance. Granted, the context for those Good Samaritan discussions was distinct and applicable more to the provision of on-site physical or medical assistance to those in need. Importantly, such laws in many other jurisdictions actually compel aid, whereas the bill in question today is essentially voluntary in nature. Still, I believe it's fair to ask why this particular Good Samaritan law, which waives liability in a voluntary context, is deemed necessary while an analogous law that would do the same for involuntary harm is not. Importantly, I think it's useful for us to put ourselves in the mindset of those rendering aid. Would their knowledge of the potential for liability inhibit their choice to render succor, even if the law would not explicitly hold them to account? Would it be better to have the waiver made explicit, as it is in this present bill, albeit in a different context? So in the final part of my speech, let me move on to practical ways that I believe the government can further advance the objectives of this sustainability practice. First, MSE can support the development of potentially an online database of potential food donors and recipients to promote scaling up at the national level. This could become then a one-stop shop which matches those in the F&B industry with those with a desire to contribute back to the community, and social welfare groups such as food banks or grassroots organizations. This will relieve these groups from the need to maintain their own independent network of suppliers and distributors. It will also help imbalances of access, where certain more connected groups are able to leverage their establishment connections to acquire a higher volume of donations, but may be left with perhaps an embarrassment of riches, even as other groups face shortages. Now, consistent with the thrust of the present bill, the site can also prominently post reminders, perhaps even explicitly require donors to declare that the four stipulations of Clause 4 of this bill are being adhered to. Second, I believe that the pervasiveness of residents participating in food rescue programs hints at the squeezed middle class in our society. In Anchorvale, we routinely welcome an average of about 130 collectors on a weekly basis. While some of these participating households are undoubtedly doing so out of an abundance of thrift or a desire to promote sustainable living, many that I've spoken to do so because the regular channels of support are unavailable to them. Indeed, the ranks have actually increased somewhat as the cost of living has risen. And as a house, we must be aware of the struggles of with the struggles with food security that are faced by Singaporeans that fall just above the threshold of assistance programs, but continue to struggle to stretch the purchasing power of their dollars. By way of conclusion, I wish to thank the many donors, coordinators, and food banks that have already stepped forward to support food sustainability programs across the nation. They have done so despite the potential liability exposure that they could have faced prior to this piece of legislation. And this speaks to both their commitment as well as courage. And for all the so-called food rescue uncles and aunties that have been tirelessly working to distribute food to those in need week after week, including our town of Sengkang. Thank you.